Good morning, good afternoon to all our listeners and participants. On behalf of the Institute of International and European Affairs, I'd like to welcome you to the fifth event in this year's Irish Aid Development Matters lecture series. My name is David Donoghue. Special thanks to Irish Aid for its continued support for this series, which gives stakeholders both here in Ireland and further afield a unique opportunity to engage with global thought leaders in the field of sustainable, of international development. We're very fortunate that we have with us as our special guest today, Achim Steiner, the Administrator of the UN Development Programme, UNDP. Achim took up this key post in the UN system in June 2017. Apart from his leadership of UNDP, which is the preeminent UN entity dealing with sustainable development, he's also the Vice Chair of the UN Sustainable Development Group, which brings together all 40 or so entities within the system which play a role in relation to sustainable development. Prior to joining UNDP, Achim led the UN Environment Programme, UNEP, from 2006 to 16, and he was also Director General of the UN office in Nairobi. He'll speak to us today on how the UNDP views the challenges presented by the COVID-19 pandemic and the future of global development in this new context. What kind of recovery strategies are needed for developing countries, particularly those with the poorest and most vulnerable populations? We invite you to send in questions using the Q&A function that you'll see. Achim will speak for 20-25 minutes to begin with, and then we'll open up the session for questions and answers from the audience. It's all on the record. So I'd first like to give the floor to the Director General of Irish Aid, Rory de Burca, who will introduce our speaker. Rory.
Thanks, David, and good morning, Achim, and hello, everyone. Achim, I know we'd hope to have you here in Dublin in person for this particular discussion. We all know why traveling at the moment, unless it's very, very essential, isn't recommended. And that's a reminder, I think, of the extraordinary times that we're living in, and why, to use the title of this lecture series, why development matters more than ever. And I think we had a taste of the extraordinary times at the weekend when the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, gave a very important speech where he challenged us all, the UN member states, the UN membership, to reinvest in the United Nations and the global order to make it fit for purpose for this century in which we are inhabiting. And I don't think that speech would have been possible even 6 months ago, prior to this pandemic. But reform has been a trope all through Antonio Guterres' leadership of the UN, and I know that reform is something which UNDP has been responding to. And I think one of the themes that the Secretary General talked about was interconnection, and the reminder of interconnection that the pandemic has given us. You know, those words of Mike Ryan and others, you know, no one is safe till everyone is safe. And I think that sets us all a challenge as UN member states, as donors, you as the administrator of the biggest part of the UN development system, a challenge on all the rest of the UN system as well, not just the development and humanitarian arms, but that interconnected piece between development, humanitarian action, the political, the security, etc. You know, and that prevention piece that the Secretary General also talks about. I was very taken with a phrase that the Secretary General used at the weekend, which was the COVID crisis laid bare risks that we've ignored for decades. Inadequate health systems, gaps in social protection, structural inequalities, environmental degradation, the climate crisis, and he went on. And in a sense, that's our agenda as Irish Aid. We've set ourselves, a number of overarching themes, climate, gender, governance, and protection. And these themes that we've been trying to address are ones that we hope as we move forward, we can work much more closely with the UN system to address. There are a lot of challenges in all of this for us all globally, and it's a time when I think there's a temptation for us to reflect, maybe selfishly, on where we are at home, what that bit of interconnection and of living in each other's shadows, as we say here, is really, really important if we want to drive change. And I think that's where we see a partnership with UNDP as being really, really essential. A functioning, effective multilateral response is the only way we can respond to a global crisis. And hopefully through that, we can work with you in that Building Back Better agenda as well. You know, and I think, you know, we want to build on the existing partnership that we have with UNDP. David mentioned the SDGs. I mean, once we get past this, hopefully not long-lasting crisis, but we will see what that COVID brings us. We still have the ambition of the SDGs and Agenda 2030, where, you know, UNDP and you personally play a really, really strong role. You know, David gave you a very good introduction. You know, in some senses, you're a man for these times. You know, your personal story bridges, you know, the developing world and the first world, you know, with German and Brazilian as part of you, you know, but also your long-standing investment in climate and the challenges of climate and development, I think, make you a man for this decade. And as we go past and through the COVID response, I think those questions around climate are going to be even stronger as we move to the second part of this decade. So there's a lot there on our agenda to be working with you over the period ahead. We'd love to have you here in person for lots of reasons. One is, you know, and primarily because we'd like to hear you and see you and have this conversation with you, not in two dimensions, but also because you being here in person would, I think, give us a signal that we move past the immediate crisis and we'd be on to the next phase, which I think is making real the Agenda 2030. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say. I think the timeliness of you being with us today is extraordinary, and thank you very much for giving us time today. Thank you, Achim.
Thanks, Ray. So Achim, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Donoghue and Rory de Walker. Thank you to the International Institute or the Institute of International European Affairs for this invitation. As you both have said, it would have been such a pleasure to be with you in Dublin. And I'm truly sorry that that was not possible, but the reasons are obvious. And I think even more important that we continue to exchange with one another. And I truly appreciate the invitation for our discussion today, because it comes at a moment in time, as both of you have alluded to already, where we as a global community, first of all, as the peoples of the world, the nations of the world, but also the United Nations faces extraordinary stress and challenges also. And my objective in trying to share some thoughts with you this morning is really to draw a line between that which is happening in the world at large and what it implies to the development arena writ large. Because I think when we talk about development, and this is just a premise I would like to put up front, I view it as much more than development aid. It is about cooperation. It is about cooperation between nations. It is also about the choices we make about the future. Development in that sense is a metaphor in every country, in every society, about the kinds of pathways that countries will choose. And perhaps at this particular moment in time, what choices do countries even have? We have a COVID-19 pandemic. We have a geopolitical arena that is more polarized than it has been for decades. And we have an economic crisis and recession unfolding that is almost without precedent. But let me begin, first of all, by offering my congratulations, and I will try to do so perhaps inadequately in the language that is not mine, but yours. Cócóir gas, congratulations to Ireland on its election to the Security Council. You could not have picked a better, and you could not have picked the worst time in which to step into this forum that in many ways is emblematic of a vision dating back to 1945, of a better way in which to resolve differences, and yet also of the brutal pragmatism that governs the Security Council, which is that, you know, the United Nations is not an institution and an idea that was established because nations are united. It is precisely because of the opposite. And so as Ireland steps into its Security Council membership and takes up its seat, I think it is particularly poignant to reflect on the role that Ireland can and hopefully will play in that larger multilateral United Nations arena, but also in the global context of what I just briefly alluded to. And I think in many ways I do congratulate Ireland, because you approach this membership with the notions of independence, empathy, and partnership. three attributes I think that we will need desperately over the coming years, because in the way that we are moving forward right now, our outlook into the future is not one that engenders great optimism. And let me begin by just reminding ourselves that not to be a pessimist, but in my capacity as the UN's representative to the G20's meeting of finance ministers and central bank governors, I participated in the session on Saturday again. And I tried to bring the Secretary General's very clear view of where we are right now, that he also expressed in the Mandela lecture that you just alluded to, namely that as the world is going at different paces and is facing different impacts and a differential reality with COVID-19, there is no doubt about it, the situation at the moment is getting worse. We are nowhere near coming out of this pandemic, whether from a health crisis perspective, certainly not from a social and economic impact perspective. And this is also related to the fact that the chronology of this pandemic is a strange one. In some countries, it begins with a health crisis. In others, it begins with a lockdown to protect yourself from a health crisis. And therefore, particularly in many developing countries, we have seen over the last few months that the social and economic impacts of the pandemic in a certain way have almost overtaken the health impacts. And the very measures that are meant to protect people from the virus are fundamentally affecting their social and economic well-being. This is a very complex challenge to tackle, and we can see that this is not just a matter of strategies and policies, it becomes intensely political, such as in the United States, where the symbol of wearing a mask has become an issue of political discord. So this is the backdrop against which I would like to reflect with you a little bit on what it might mean to be a member of the Security Council for Ireland at this moment, its strong commitment on development and humanitarian responses, and its view of a global community that, as we know so clearly, can only win this battle against the virus if it does so together and acts both jointly and in solidarity. Let me for a moment turn to the UN, because this is the backdrop against which we are coming together this morning, and certainly everybody in Ireland might be forgiven for wondering whether stepping into the Security Council right now is the best moment for Ireland to play that role. I would argue absolutely, not only because of the three strategic objectives that you laid out, but also because it is in moments of stress and in moments of discord that we need places and spaces where we come together as nations and try to, first of all, arrive at a common assessment of what needs to be done, to be able to act in unison despite different interests, despite political differences, and to do so in a transparent way. And to all those who rightly are frustrated with the Security Council, whether in terms of its membership today, whether in its initial inability to even agree on a ceasefire resolution and a response to the COVID-19 pandemic, rest assured, it is better that that discord, which is real and exists in the world out there, transacts itself in the spotlight of the Security Council in front of the world as a whole, and with the prospect that as long as nations talk to each other, they have less reason to go to war with each other. And that remains a fundamental principle that should make us all very protective of the idea of the United Nations, also of the challenged reality of a Security Council, and therefore the politics of trying to navigate in this moment in time a global response, but also global solidarity and global capacity to address this pandemic is principally premised on the United Nations being a forum in which we can come together. But let me also be very clear, in the United Nations of today, and it is the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, there is, besides the political fora and the negotiations, a significant capacity that we can also call the operational capacity. Over 40 agencies, funds, and programs covering virtually every aspect of how nations relate to each other, whether it is postal services, whether it is shipping, airlines, health, children, climate change, agriculture, intellectual property. All these agencies and funds and programs are part of the backbone that allows us as nations to collaborate and to cooperate with one another. That operational system of the United Nations, perhaps unbeknownst to many because of the great focus on one's own reality and a certain degree of understandable inward-looking response to this crisis has actually been working non-stop, 24/7, without shutting down across the world. As the world, as countries, as communities had to focus inwards, the United Nations immediately stepped up, whether it is the World Food Programme, keeping over 100 million people alive, the High Commission on Refugees, the United Nations Development Programme, UNICEF, looking particularly after the welfare of children and the importance of maintaining vaccination programs. We have not stopped for one day. Our colleagues right now, and in UNDP, that is 17,000 people working in 170 countries, are on the front lines of actually supporting governments to maintain, first of all, their ability to operate, but secondly, also to assist them in this emergency, to respond, to be able to drive strategies that are coordinated internationally, but that also depend on support and collaboration from partners. That United Nations is perhaps something that we also need to bring a little bit more to the attention of our citizens, because it is both the embodiment of a promise we made in 1945 and that has evolved over time, but it is actually at this very moment one of the vital platforms on which we can support one another. And as we know, this pandemic, this virus will not stop unless we all are able to stop it. And that is the fundamental premise from a purely selfish point of view, in which we need to look at collaboration. But I think that is also reaching too short, because our public is extremely conscious of the fact that we are entering into a period of fiscal stress wherever you look around the world. And indeed, just now as we speak, the European Council is in its fourth day, a record meeting of the heads of government since the year 2000, in trying to thrash out, first of all, a European response in terms of Europe's economies, but through its budget, ultimately also its ability to commit to play a major role in the global recovery and response to COVID-19. Now, if I may briefly just point out, when you look at COVID-19 through a development perspective, the first thing that is striking, and the United Nations Development Programme's Human Development Report a few weeks ago put out a scenario that for the first time in measuring the Human Development Index for 30 years, we are facing a situation where we will actually have a decline in human development. This is unprecedented, and I could now bring you many figures and numbers, but just a couple to show the magnitude of what it is to both cope with and what the price would be if we do not come together in coping with it. Over 100 million people face a decline into extreme poverty as a result of COVID-19. Up to 250 million people could face extreme hunger and food and nutritional stress over the coming months, as they are unable to either buy food or to access food. We are looking at an economic and livelihoods collapse of literally hundreds of millions of people. As economies shut down, we often forget that in many developing countries, the informal sector, that sector that is built on the entrepreneurial and survival spirits of individuals, the corner shop, the workshop, the service provider, the carpenter, these are in many economies 70 to 80% of all jobs, in inverted commas. These are the livelihoods. You lock down, you shut down, you have no job, there is no social safety net, you have no income. And to some extent, you can extrapolate that even to, let's say, small island developing states. A middle income economy that is dependent on tourism currently no longer has an economy. It is a brutal reality that is playing out. And it is one that in these first few months, people have been trying to resort to the reserves they have, the fiscal resources that may be at their disposal, and to some extent, the stepping forward of the IMF and the World Bank in providing credit lines clearly has been critical to ensure that that fiscal space for governments to respond is available. But everyone knows that that fiscal space is not going to be enough. This pandemic is not over. The numbers are going up. In many countries, they're still increasing exponentially, and we are facing a prolonged period of economic recession, the likes of which we have not seen for a long time. So that is the backdrop against which we need to judge the development choices, the development capacities to respond, and the ability of both national governments and societies, but also the international community, to remain capable of acting. Now, this is in many respects often seen as a health crisis. I would argue very strongly that we are actually seeing an unprecedented development emergency and quickly escalating into a crisis. Why do I say that? Well, some of the numbers I just provided you with already illustrate that. Our global economy is clearly one that is not going to recover quickly. And here I also caution us to not be misled perhaps by the stock exchanges. If you look to Wall Street, to the Dow Jones, or you look to London or Singapore or Hong Kong, you might be forgiven for wondering how come that stock markets seem to be recovering so quickly. Well, we saw that already in 2008 and 2009. We live in many respects in a dual reality. Financial markets do not reflect the reality of citizens' lives and livelihoods. They are to some extent a separate track on which, yes, certain things in our economies are measured, but above all, it is sentiment. How else would you explain that we are, since weeks, having significant recoveries on stock markets, and yet everything else that we are looking at in the world at large speaks to the opposite? It is one of the reasons why we also are so strongly convinced, and the Secretary General has repeatedly called for this, that we cannot just go back to the normal of yesterday. And both David and Rory already alluded to it. We were already in a world that was facing many stresses. The Secretary General's speech on Saturday, the Mandela Lecture, drew significantly also on the analysis of the 2019 Human Development Report, which was focused on inequality, and argued that behind the averages that we often use, behind the narrow view of per capita income, is hidden a much more complex story of development failures. And we saw over the last 2 years where that leads to. This is not just economics, it is not just poverty, it is not just noticing that inequality is growing, it has political ramifications, political polarization. People all over the world, from Hong Kong to Paris to Santiago de Chile to Beirut, stepping out into the streets because they are disengaging from our political processes and institutions, should worry us deeply. And that is part of the development crisis that I see unfolding before our very eyes right now. Take a region such as the Sahel. Without support from outside, without significant efforts within the region, we may see not only political polarization and protest, we will actually see more radicalization, more extremism, and more areas of the world in which a view of society, of the rule of law, and of governance will simply vanish. These are the underlying conditions of a world that currently is trying to deal with a COVID-19 pandemic, and it is precisely these inequalities that have been put into such stark relief in this crisis. Poor people, vulnerable people, women, children, 1.2 billion children not being able to attend school, an extraordinary number. And we know that even if schools reopen, quite a number of them will never return to their education, girls in particular in certain parts of the world. This is the real cost of this pandemic. It is not just a temporary one. Now, what can we do in the way that we respond? And I want to end with that, if you allow me, David. Certainly there is no silver bullet, but at the beginning I already alluded to the fact that as Ireland enters the Security Council, as the European Union, which will emerge as a critical anchor and player in that international development arena, we face a situation which we have to address, first of all, macroeconomic issues, no question about it. And the G20 so far is found wanting, if I may be very honest with you, and it is something that the Secretary General has repeatedly appealed also to the G20, because that macroeconomic stability is one fundamental premise upon which countries can then respond. The credit lines that the IMF has provided are vital, but they will add to national debt. What the World Bank may be able to lend and the increased fiscal space that this creates is a short-term bonus in a government's ability to respond. But what do we do beyond that? The Secretary General has said that we need an equivalent response to what countries in the developed world have stood up for themselves, somewhere around 10% plus of global GDP. We need to address the injection of both fiscal resources and, secondly, more structural challenges related to debt. I have no doubt that on the current trajectory, by the end of this year, early into next year, the world will face in many parts, in many countries, a severe debt crisis. Not acting on it now, not being able to agree, not only amongst countries and the Paris Club, but non-Paris Club members, and also the corporate world, banks and funds, because we have unprecedented levels of corporate debt today in the world, much more so than in 2008 and 2009. That kind of concerted response is fundamental and essential to avoid a situation where countries will default with all the consequences for that country standing in the financial markets, but also for the global financial system. So that is one tier of response. The second one clearly has to be that we need to look at how we can help countries to quickly deal with this terrible dilemma. The more effective you are in containing the virus, the more brutal an impact you have on your economy and society. The way in which we can reduce that contradiction is to actually have the fiscal means by which to enable people and communities and national economies to sustain a more targeted effort. Certainly complete lockdowns will become less and less feasible, but we're learning to be more targeted. But we also need to look at how we will be able to maintain people's livelihoods. If they cannot stay at home, they will simply break out onto the streets, and we have seen how the virus quickly picks up its pace again. That is why UNDP in a few days' time is looking at putting out a paper that will try to study the impacts of these cash transfer programs, their extraordinary impact that they're having, but also looking at the temporary basic income notion as perhaps one way in which we very effectively can ensure that people are able to maintain the health crisis response actions while not going into starvation mode. And this is one area where I believe we need a great deal of thinking, and where particularly richer nations will now become either the backbone or the constraint on countries being able to act in that direction. Now, for me and for my colleagues in the United Nations Development Programme, we have begun in a first phase of this COVID-19 response to focus on basically being able to help countries maintain their operational capacity, respond with the World Health Organization, WFP, UNICEF and others in quickly being able to provide emergency supplies to countries, as you know, in these first few weeks, something that was not available in many developing countries. Some didn't even have ventilators available. But our response that we have now put out, our strategy is based on our role as the socio-economic lead within the United Nations Development System, where the Secretary General has requested us to work with our resident coordinators in UN country teams in over 130 countries, actually covering 160 nations, to assist with an assessment together with the government of the priorities, the vulnerabilities, but then also to work with them on their socio-economic response strategies. These will be fundamental in, first of all, making very difficult choices. These are, in some people's minds, trade-offs. I would rather refer to them as choices, because bailing out an airline and maybe saving 5,000 jobs versus bailing out perhaps 100,000 small, medium-scale enterprises, saving 1 or 2 million jobs, these are the literally everyday choices that heads of government and national institutions face right now. How do you make those choices? What matters? Where do you invest first? And how do you ensure that the mitigation measures, the investments you make now to stabilize this crisis, are actually investments into a future development path recovery? This is where I see UNDP's role being absolutely central, both in the way that governments can be assisted, but also as part of the UN development system. And in our offer that we have put forward, it has been interesting that 4 areas emerge from the demand of countries as central to their immediate response, with a view to also investing in a recovery. Governance and agency. The notions that government, the role of government in this crisis is fundamental, its ability to continue to operate, for parliaments to be able to meet. And sometimes it is literally down to providing a Zoom license for a government to be able to continue to meet, for parliament to meet and approve an emergency budget. We have over 180 digital solutions that we have deployed with countries in a completely new context just in the last 12 weeks. The second area is social protection. For obvious reasons, we need to identify the most vulnerable. We need to look at where, for example, gender differentiated responses are called for, how children are affected, people with disability, those who live in the rural economy, and what kind of measures can be put in place. Cash transfers, the digital platforms are extraordinary opportunities for us to do things that were perhaps on the horizon in 5 years' time are now being stood up literally in weeks. Thirdly, the green economy. Many governments at the moment are looking at how they can address not just an issue such as climate change or the loss of biodiversity and ecosystems or pollution, but how to invest in an economic strategy that allows them to have less risks, more resilience, and take advantage of the shovel-ready projects, such as in Africa right now. Renewable energy, off-grid energy could be one of the major boosts to a continent where more than 60% of people in this day and age do not yet have access to electricity. And finally, digital disruption and innovation. I do not need to speak a lot about it. We are seeing it in our everyday lives, but just remember, 50% of the world's population does not yet have access to broadband and internet. We could change that in just a few years. We could connect every school in a developing country on the continent of Africa to broadband and to internet. Imagine what it would do for education. These are the kinds of projects, these are the kinds of ideas that I think our taxpayers, our citizens can relate to. Not just bailout packages, but generational projects that demonstrate solidarity, partnership, and a fundamental change in the outlook of development for the future. So David, if you allow me, let me end by saying that I do consider today's discussion not just one amongst many. I truly treasure Ireland's self-view of itself in the international arena, its deep and long-standing commitment to humanitarian responses, but also to the United Nations, multilateralism, and to development. I hope that as part of your role in the UN, in the European Union, and as an actor in your own right in the development arena, the coming months and year will demonstrate that you don't always have to be a large nation in order to have a significant impact. We need voices that provide clarity, rationality, independence, and that build cooperative and collective capacity to act, not dividing us, not polarizing us, and therefore paralyzing us as a world community. That is also very much the focus of the Secretary General and of all of us working in the United Nations. We are extremely worried about the geopolitics, but we know that we have been through tough times before, and here in our 75th year, our promise holds, and that is very much true of the UN as it is of UNDP. Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much, Achim, for that comprehensive and marvelous analysis. I have to say it's a compelling analysis of where we are at the moment in the context of COVID-19, but it's also a somber one and troubling in many ways. We'll have a number of questions. Let me kick off with one which arises from something you were, one of the many points you made. If we, I mean, there's no doubt that collective solutions, collective action is more important than ever in order to come out of this situation in a sustainable way, and you brought that out. But on the other hand, the political will is patchy, to put it mildly. We've seen countries retreating into nationalist and protectionist reflexes, for example, over the search for vaccines, and quite a number of countries have been guilty in that respect. Can one be confident that as the scale of the crisis deepens further, and you pointed to the macroeconomic pressures that we're all facing, can one be confident that somehow the need for concerted global action will become more apparent? I mean, one can think of political changes in certain countries which might expedite that, but one can't be absolutely certain. I mean, looking at the next 6 months to a year, do you think that we will be able to recover that sort of global consensus, which has enabled us, for example, to use the UN to produce the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement? The UN has come into its own in recent years because it was possible to find a global consensus. Do you see that consensus coming back, as it were, over the next 6 to 12 months?
Well, David, I think it is to some extent a speculation. I think right now we would have many reasons to be concerned. I think the short-term outlook that we see in the G20, in the negotiation of the communique that I followed just over the last week, the discussions in the Security Council are clearly reflective of a hardening of a geopolitical scenario in which China and the US, first of all, are clearly in an increasingly standoff mode. And unfortunately, as we know, when key global powers do not see the reason or the need to collaborate, it inevitably impacts the whole global system. So our capacity to respond, our collective action ability clearly is impaired at the moment. And I think it is to some extent a function of also that larger geopolitical picture. But having said that, we have been through these crises before, whether it is a Cold War or whether it is in a regional context. Sooner or later, that political strategy does not seem to pay off. And, you know, even if you look at many who currently say multilateralism is facing a crisis, I would argue, well, you know, after 75 years and many crises, perhaps we should have a little bit more confidence in the fact that the system has actually been designed in a way to survive stress and to survive disunity and to some extent at those moments also show dysfunctionality. But the truth is, if you look at how the world is in fact trying to collaborate, then the vast and overwhelming majority of countries are turning to our international institutions. The Bretton Woods institutions clearly in this economically highly distressed moment being the first line of defense. And the ability of the IMF, reformed and with more resources after the 2008-2009 financial crisis, is able to deploy up to $1 trillion in resources right now. That is a good illustration of this. And as I mentioned, the United Nations operational system, with the support of many donors who have reprogrammed funds initially, is in fact standing up a response. And even in the political complex arena of the World Health Organization, what you have seen is one country stepping back, all others maintaining their view that, yes, there are challenges, but this is the institution, this is where collective action is possible. But let me be very honest, I think there are moments when the world indeed faces something that could be consequential for years to come. You mentioned the vaccine. The Secretary General and many others have called for a people's vaccine. And I think it is extremely important that we do remember how critical the handling of the vaccine, should it even become available, will be. It could be the moment where the world truly sees the value of coming together, or it could be a terrible moment when we really fall apart because the rich, the wealthy, those who control intellectual property will corner a market that clearly overnight cannot produce 7 billion vaccines. So working together here is crucial. And I think common sense hopefully will prevail. And even those who at the moment are in a polarized relationship with one another can step back from that precipice. And you know, this is something that runs through the whole history of development. Some of you may know that expression of the tragedy of the commons. It basically says that, you know, individuals will go and use a pasture, and you know, because if it is not agreed how the community will use it, everybody will use it to their own advantage until the pasture collapses and everybody has no more grazing left. It goes from the fundamentals of something as simple as that in a development choice to a global response to vaccines. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Achim. I have a number of questions which are coming in, focusing on the issue of resources and donors' willingness to provide finances and so on. Let me perhaps give you a couple together. One colleague, Professor Patrick Paul Walsh of University College Dublin, looks at the question of the withdrawal of US funding from the WHO and really asks more generally, against the background of that kind of dramatic development, should the UN system be looking more at funding in partnership with, you know, the private sector and non-governmental organizations? In other words, to what does one need to take a different route in terms of providing funding in future for the work of the UN system? Another questioner, Barbara White from Concern, worries in the same way about a decrease in funding for UN agencies because of populist politics and indeed recession. So what do you anticipate the future will hold for the funding of UN agencies, whether it'll be an increase, holding, or a decrease? And the third question, I'll stop at that point, is from Padraig Carmody of Trinity College, Dublin. Do you support the issuing of new special drawing rights by the IMF? And if so, what do you think the priority area for spending should be?
Thank you, David, and thank you to all the questioners. So why should we be concerned about financing? I don't think it takes a lot of imagination to realize that the outlook at the moment could be very concerning. First of all, we have, and I often say to some extent understandable, the initial focus being on domestic response. Governments are judged by their citizens on how they're able to protect them. So the COVID-19 situation and pandemic clearly has initially led to countries looking inward, to the point where, you know, they even in Europe struggle to sometimes see that the European project is actually one that is very much premised on being able to work with one another in this crisis. Now extrapolate that to a global community, and clearly we have seen in the first few months a very inadequate response. But I qualify that inadequate term with simply saying this is also in some respects understandable. I think what would be less understandable and probably in the long term less forgivable if we then see a more structural inclination towards cutting overseas development assistance, international financing. I think it would be short-sighted, it would backfire, and it would be the opposite of the logic of what every country is doing domestically. So surely the argument that we do not lean forward right now is going to take us in the opposite direction. So yet the outlook, just take GDP. Everybody is facing a contracting national economy. If it is between 4 and 5% of GDP, even the current percentage commitments of countries will decline. So it's not enough to simply say we are committed to ODA. In fact, we need to lean forward. We need to persuade our citizens that investing at this moment in time is in our own self-interest as countries that provide donor funding, and it is also in the self-interest of a global community that needs to be able to, first of all, help particularly poorer countries absorb the shocks. Otherwise, we will face more and more political crisis. Secondly, we need to lean forward to avoid the kind of government default that would lead to significant consequences in financial markets. And I believe that that is realizable. But let me just give an example that I think many in Ireland will be able to relate to. Mark Lowcock, my colleague, the Emergency Relief Coordinator in the United Nations, leads our efforts to raise humanitarian funding. We just increased the appeal to the world to 10 billion last week. But after 3 months, the initial response stood at somewhere around $1.8 billion. $1.8 billion from the entire international community for the UN to respond to over 70 million refugees and displaced, over 100 million people who are currently receiving food rations, and our ability to respond in countries like Yemen or Libya, where people literally have nothing, and we are currently cutting rations, we are closing health centers because funding is not coming through. Yet the bailout package of one airline, let me pick Lufthansa for that matter, but it could be Air France, KLM, it could be others, but just Lufthansa's bailout is worth more than 2 to 3 times the entire financing currently being provided in this crisis for saving lives, literally saving lives. And we are talking about trillions, $11 trillion perhaps being deployed in domestic response packages. Surely we must find a way to persuade our political leaders, but also our public, because this is going to be the arena in which politicians have to make decisions, members of parliament, that in supporting the most vulnerable, in helping developing countries recover and contain the pandemic, we are not taking something away from them. We are hopefully creating a more likely prospect for a recovery to happen in Europe, in the United States, in Japan as well. So on the SDRs, I think without question, there are 1 or 2 countries that remain skeptical. The overwhelming majority in the IMF support the special drawing rights being used. I think they will be part of the firepower of the IMF, which clearly under the leadership of Kristalina Georgieva has proven vital in these first few months. But we also have to look very clearly at the fact that both IMF and World Bank, as I mentioned before, are providing credit lines. And therefore, this must be embedded in a larger strategy to address debt, not only debt standstills, but we need to start looking about debt forgiveness, debt restructuring. And that's where significant generational programs, such as providing access to electricity in Africa, investing in bringing broadband to schools, become the kind of shovel-ready projects that can start tomorrow, can create employment and help the poorest of the poor to not face destitution. It is in that context that this sort of financing needs to be addressed. Back to you, David.
Thank you very much, Achim. I suppose the general picture of international willingness to provide resources in this context is gloomy. Let's be honest. But one questioner, Seamus McGardle of SRI Executive, asks, do you feel there are any rays of hope in relation to particular governments or countries and enlightened policies or steps they are taking at the present time? Are there good examples that we can point to against this gloomy backdrop?
Well, I would say there are good examples probably across many countries right now, but they are of a magnitude and an initial nature that is not commensurate or adequate. So I think I don't want to give any country right now a sort of, well, you've done enough, but I think there are some that are stepping forward, and I think particularly the European Union. And as I said, as we speak today, European Council is meeting in Brussels for a historic task. And I would say it is the European Union, and again, Ireland within the European Union could play an extraordinary role, because it is in the EU that I think many recognize right now the greatest capacity to look outwards to the world, and despite the polarization in the geopolitical arena, to provide significant positive impulses. And I want to recognize some countries, because in the midst of this crisis, many donors have been willing to reprogram the European Commission with us. Germany, in fact, has just doubled its core contribution to UNDP to almost 120 million this year as part of its new supplementary budget that it adopted just a couple of weeks ago in Parliament. Also here in the United States, I mean, in the congressional resolutions, there have been significant targeted increases in funding. So there are for the Bretton Woods institutions. So there are examples, and let me mention Japan also. I speak now from a UNDP perspective. $65 million in emergency COVID funding made available, immediately deployed, and this is where the strength of UNDP, I think, in concert with our country teams, but also our partners in the civil society and NGO sector, works. We stood up a rapid financing facility, and we managed to turn around approvals in 72 hours and put programs on the ground in literally, I think it was 8 weeks in 130 countries. And we are continuing to build on that, because that operational backbone is a part of the financing debate also. If you are able to mobilize funding, how do you then, in a highly stressed economic and even institutional context where governments are stressed, how do you land it so it actually reaches people and it can stimulate the economy in critical areas? And I did not respond in your previous question to the question of the private sector. The private sector is an integral part. I mean, first of all, if you look at where people earn their livelihoods, it's in the small, medium-scale enterprise sector. It's 98% of the world's businesses are small, medium-scale enterprises. It may surprise some. And it is therefore the ability to also work with them and their economies to recover, but also with companies. I mean, we have many partnerships in the digital arena right now. In the last few weeks, unprecedented setting up platforms in the digital arena, connectivity, countering false information, reaching 2 billion people with the United Nations family. These are partnerships that work, but let's also be clear. Right now, we have a very strange situation where actually it is government that is stepping in to stabilize the private sector and taking public funding and taking a stake in the private sector to stabilize it. Hopefully the moment will come where the private sector will be able to also invest in macroeconomic recovery and in the sustainable development goals as a strategy for building forward better, because this is where we need private sector leaders also to embrace the reality we face, and the need for transformation on climate change, on inequality, on poverty, on healthcare systems. I think the relationship between government and the market is fundamental, and thankfully we are out of the, I'm either somebody who believes government is the solution to everything, or the Milton Friedman view, the less government, the better. That era is over. We need smart government working with markets and the private sector, And that's where the $300 trillion in wealth that we have accumulated in this moment in time, unprecedented human history, could easily be deployed into helping us out of this crisis. So there is money in the world, there is money in the financial markets, but if we cannot find a way in which government and markets work together, that money simply remains in lockdown.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Achim. I have a question from Jill Clemens from Ireland's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. She points out that UNDP works alongside its UN colleagues in complex contexts, including and particularly fragile and conflict-affected regions. Could you provide an example to show us how the UN system is responding to or how it's repurposing its core work in light of the pandemic and the new stresses that this is bringing?
Thank you very much. And to Jill's point, I mean, I should mention that UNDP is actually in the UN family, one of the agencies most heavily invested in fragile and conflict countries. Almost 45% of our total annual turnover is actually invested in 10 fragile conflict affected countries. So it gives you a sense of how heavily the attempt to try and respond from a development perspective is also part of UNDP's approach. We see ourselves in the Sahel, in Libya, but also in Yemen, in the Central African Republic, just to mention 4 countries that are facing different kinds of crises, Somalia being another one, Iraq. These are places where, you know, we begin to, first of all, under highly constrained conditions, because in some of them conflict continues. And if you look at Yemen right now, and the UN has tried and continues to try everything from the political mediation to the humanitarian response to also development. And in Yemen, we have been trying, and here working very closely with the World Bank, the European Union and Commission, and individual countries, also donor countries, to provide employment, livelihoods, training, so that people can begin to survive the crisis of war and conflict. But in addition, right now in Yemen, the harsh truth is that funds are insufficient to even provide the basic humanitarian support. So yes, we are not in a great place, and I think we will need to confront these immediate funding needs in the context of longer-term financing. But in Libya, we have very quickly been able to provide, for instance, local government institutions, who are perhaps the most hopeful and functional level of government right now, with critical infrastructure, be it ambulances, digital connectivity in order to manage COVID, testing and tracking systems that are put in place. And, you know, sometimes it doesn't take a highly developed OECD country to manage a significant testing and tracking effort. We saw that in the DRC during the Ebola outbreak. In the DRC, with the support of the UN, WHO, and others, there were at some points in time over 30,000 people being tested and tracked, or tracked digitally, which is more than some European countries have been able to put in place within 3 or 4 months. So our ability obviously depends very much on each country. The kind of financing is also critical. We need humanitarian finance, but I often say it is in the bringing together of an immediate saving lives response and an investment in people's ability to build a development pathway forward that both recovery and ultimately peace building are far more likely to succeed.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Achim. A question from Caoimhe de Barra, who's the head of TROCRA, which, as you know, is a leading development and humanitarian organization in Ireland. Caoimhe makes the point that there is perhaps an opportunity in the present pandemic situation to, sorry, I'm just reading out her message. That there's perhaps an opportunity to develop a more structured approach to eradicating poverty, and in particular to put in place shock responsive social protection systems across low and middle income countries. Do you agree that that opportunity exists? And I suppose, would you have views on whether Ireland could play a role in that respect?
Absolutely, and I thank her for raising this question, because I think, you know, in every crisis there lies an opportunity. It sounds a very vacuous statement, but it is ultimately true. This is human history. And I often actually remember my my visit to Dublin and being intrigued to learn about the history of one of your greatest and proudest exports born out of a tragedy, Guinness. I mean, there are many ways in which we as humans, but also as communities and societies, rise to a challenge in the moments of crisis. And I think right now, it is first of all the recognition that poor people are simply unable to protect themselves in this crisis. And I think we do need to put a very strong focus on vulnerability and poverty embedded in that larger understanding of inequality, which is so corrosive in many of our societies. And again, that UNDP Human Development Report, Beyond Income, Beyond Averages, Beyond Today of last year, very much put a focus on the connection between poverty and inequality, but also the resilience of societies and nations. Now, I made a brief reference earlier on that in these times where we witnessed Togo setting up in 4 weeks a cash transfer program for over 1 million people, Pakistan reaching over 70 million people, 12 million households, and the examples abound. We perhaps need to look very carefully also at notions of temporary basic income. I think this is, still a debate that is unfolding in the larger macroeconomic policy and development arena when we talk about universal basic incomes. But I think there can be little doubt in our minds that if we want people to adhere to the pandemic containment strategies, we have to give them a means with which to be able to practice that. So distancing, minimizing interactions, going beyond an absolute lockdown, requires us to be able to help people to at least have access to basic food and basic services. So in a few days' time, we will publish a paper in which we are putting forward scenarios for a temporary basic income that could apply to perhaps 3 billion people in national context, financed through national resources and international financing. And it may be surprising to some that the effectiveness and the financeability of such an approach is actually not at all in the astronomic domain. And therefore, my response would be, we do need to focus on the poorest, the most vulnerable. If that part of our society and community goes into survival and crisis mode, the entire national economy, the entire national political process will face extremely stressful conditions. And if you look to regions such as the Sahel, you can imagine what that will lead to. It will simply open the doors to those who say governments are of no value. It is in our radical movements, it is in radicalization and the extremism that they preach that your future lies. And then they bring their financial resources to bear on those communities in desperation. So whether you look at it from an ethical, a humanitarian, or a political strategy and security perspective, there is no doubt in my mind that our focus on the poor, on poverty and inequality is fundamental in the crisis, in the instruments we put in place to manage the crisis, and in designing ways forward. And that is why also perhaps a last reference on Friday last week, I think we launched the 2020 Multi-Dimensional Poverty Index, which we produced together with OPHI at the University of Oxford and UNDP. And the harsh truth is 1.3 billion people are living in a multi-dimensional poverty reality right now, going well beyond the $1.90 simple income threshold that puts it at around 700 million. So these are the lenses we have to apply to understand this reality and to be able to act on it.
Indeed. A question from Michael McCarthy Flynn of Oxfam Ireland. In a way, it touches on the issue of global inequality that you've just mentioned. I mean, he notes that the Secretary General made the point at the weekend that the underlying challenge holding back human development is global inequality. This may be difficult to answer, but what do you think are the main solutions to global inequality? And he asks also whether you have a view on a role that Ireland might play in that respect.
Well, let me start with the second part of the question. I think the first part is, as I said earlier on, you don't have to be the United States or China or another mega economy in order to take your seat in the Security Council and speak. And in the United Nations, perhaps one of its most brilliant design features is that every country has a voice and has a seat at the table. So articulating, first of all, the importance and providing not just a description of the problem, but also the policy space and the alliances of countries in an international community to face the reality of poverty, of inequality, and being able to move forward, I think is critical. In more practical terms, since we don't have much time, I don't want to be oversimplistic, but perhaps to those who are interested, I would urge you to take another look at the UNDP's Human Development Report 2019. It was focused on inequality, and it spoke about the legacy of inequalities from the past, but also two major other drivers, namely climate change and digital technology. If left unaddressed, they will become amplifiers of inequality very quickly. If we address them proactively, they could actually be drivers for reducing inequality. And that is the kind of policy agenda that we need to focus on.
Achim, thank you very, very much for that. Unfortunately, that brings us to the end of our session. And I'd like to thank you for being so generous in your time and in your comments and analysis. There is much that could keep us going for hours, in fact. Thank you for everything that you've contributed to us today. I know that my colleagues at the UN work closely with you and the UNDP, and now that we are joining the Security Council, there is a very important common agenda, as it were, which they will want to pursue. And your remarks today have increased our sensitivity to the development and humanitarian dimensions of the current crisis, and I am sure that we will want to reflect in our input to the Security Council everything that you have been discussing with us today. On my own behalf, on behalf of the Institute, Achim, thank you very, very much. I just asked Rory de Burca whether he would like to have a final word. Rory, are you there? No, he's not. Okay, Achim, thank you so much. And I hope that we will get you in person to Dublin at some point. You were very, very kind to join us today. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you to all of you, and thank you to the Institute for hosting us, and hopefully see you soon.